So let me get this straight, Maggie said, looking at my rather ambitious order for dozens of clematis vines. You want to cover your house in vines because your HOA doesn't like your porch plants? Exactly, I said, nodding enthusiastically. Think vertical garden. Think living wall. Think the greenest house in Arboretum Acres. Maggie stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. You're serious? Dead serious, I said. I have a situation with my HOA president, and this is my response. Maggie grinned. I love it. This is going to be amazing, but are you sure about this? This particular clematis. It's a bit of a grower. That's the point, I said. I want it to be aggressive. I want it to be unstoppable. I want it to be the botanical equivalent of a middle finger. You got it, Maggie said, shaking her head and chuckling. I'll get your order ready. And hey, can I get pictures when it's done? This is going on my website. And so the planting began. My porch was my sanctuary, a riot of color and life, a tiny jungle in the midst of the meticulously manicured lawns of Arboretum Acres. It was my happy place. Until she appeared. I saw her approaching from down the street, her figure a stiff, disapproving silhouette against the morning sun. Karen. Even from a distance, I could practically feel her disapproval radiating towards me like a heat-seeking missile of beige conformity. Her expression was already pinched, her lips pressed into a thin, judgmental line. This couldn't be good. I, Jack Riley, am not a troublemaker. I'm a live and let live kind of guy. I enjoy my quiet mornings, my gardening, and the occasional glass of wine on my plant-filled porch, but I also have a strong sense of justice, a deep-seated aversion to arbitrary rules, and a particular fondness for my plants. They weren't just decorations. They were my companions, my little green friends, my connection to nature in the otherwise sterile environment of Arboretum Acres, a name, I often thought, that was dripping with irony. Karen stopped in front of my house, her eyes scanning my porch with an expression of undisguised horror. Mr. Riley, she said, her voice tight with disapproval, we need to talk about your plants. Good morning, Karen, I replied, forcing a smile. They're lovely, aren't they? The geraniums are particularly vibrant this year. They're excessive, Mr. Riley, Karen declared, ignoring my attempt at pleasantries. They're too many. They're too cluttered. They're blocking the view of your house. Blocking the view? I repeated, incredulous. They're plants, Karen. They're supposed to be visible. They're attracting insects, she continued, her voice rising in pitch. Bees, butterflies, and who knows what else might be lurking in that jungle. They're pollinators, Karen, I explained, trying to remain calm. They're beneficial. They're part of nature. Nature, Karen said with a shudder, belongs outside of Arboretum Acres, Mr. Riley. We have standards. We have an aesthetic. And your porch, it simply doesn't conform. She made up a rule, claiming I couldn't have plants on my porch. I'll report you. And with that, Karen turned. And, as if on cue, the dreaded HOA notice arrived a few days later. It was an official, typed letter on crisp white paper, informing me that my porch plants were in violation of community guidelines. Your porch plants, the letter stated, are deemed excessive and must be significantly reduced within 1 week. Failure to comply will result in a fine. I stared at the letter, my initial reaction one of disbelief. They were fining me for having too many plants on my own porch. It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was infuriating. This wasn't just about plants. It was about control. It was about Karen and the HOA trying to dictate every aspect of my life, to force me into their mold of beige conformity. And I, Jack Riley, was not about to let that happen. My internal monologue was a whirlwind of outrage, indignation, and a growing determination to fight back. "They want to take away my plants?" I muttered to myself. "Fine, let them try, but they're going to regret messing with a man and his geraniums." The HOA meeting was, predictably, a soul-crushing experience. Held in the Arboretum Acres Community Center, a building that looked suspiciously like a repurposed bomb shelter, it was an exercise in bureaucratic pettiness and beige-tinted tyranny. Karen, of course, was there. She sat at the head of the long table, looking like a queen on her beige throne, her expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and barely concealed disdain. She wasn't officially on the board, not this time, but she was clearly the driving force behind this botanical inquisition. "Mr. Riley," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension, "your porch has been brought to our attention." "My porch?" I replied, keeping my voice even. "What about it?" "The plants, Mr. Riley," she said, her lips curling in distaste. "The excessive, unruly, utterly inappropriate plants that are currently cluttering your porch and creating an eyesore for the entire community." "They're flowers, Karen," I said, trying to remain calm. "And herbs, and a small lemon tree. They're living things. They're beautiful." "They're a violation, Mr. Riley," she declared. "They're blocking the view of your house. They're attracting insects. They're lowering property values." "Lowering property values," I repeated, incredulous. "How exactly is a pot of geraniums going to cause a real estate crash?" "It's the principle of the thing, Mr. Riley," Karen insisted. "We have standards in Arboretum Acres. We have an aesthetic. And your porch, it simply doesn't conform." I tried to reason with her. I pointed out that there were no specific rules against porch plants in the HOA bylaws. I explained that my plants were well maintained, that they weren't blocking any walkways or creating any hazards. I even offered to rearrange them to make them more aesthetically pleasing to the HOA's discerning eye. The other board members, a collection of mostly bored-looking retirees, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a woman with a surprisingly vibrant collection of succulents on her windowsill, I'd seen them during one of my walks, even gave me a small, sympathetic smile. But Karen? She was unmoved. She was a woman on a mission to eradicate all traces of botanical exuberance from Arboretum Acres. "The plants," she declared, slamming her gavel down with unnecessary force, "must be significantly reduced. You have 1 week, Mr. Riley, and the fine stands." I walked out of that meeting, my blood boiling, my sense of injustice reaching critical levels. Karen had declared war on my plants. And I, Jack Riley, was not about to surrender. It was time to fight back, but not with words, with vines. 1 week. That's all the time Karen and her beige brigade had given me to significantly reduce my beloved porch plants, to decimate my miniature jungle, to transform my colorful oasis into a barren wasteland of HOA-approved nothingness. 1 week to absolutely, positively not comply. My first stop, naturally, was the internet. I researched HOA power, landscaping restrictions, and, most importantly, vines. Fast-growing vines, invasive vines, vines that could cover an entire house in a matter of weeks. I was on a mission. And then I started in again on the HOA bylaws. I needed to find a weakness and ambiguity, something I could exploit. I read and reread every section, every clause, every footnote, searching for the key to my victory. And then I found it. It was in the section on porch and patio regulations. There were rules about the number and size of potted plants allowed on porches. There were restrictions on clutter and obstructions. But, and this was the crucial part, there was nothing, not a single word, about plants growing directly on the house. There was a vague clause about maintaining the exterior appearance of the home in a manner consistent with community standards, but that was subjective, open to interpretation, and, I suspected, easily defensible. "Consistent with community standards," I muttered, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Oh, I'll show them consistent." The seed of an idea, a gloriously green and slightly terrifying idea, was starting to sprout. Operation Vine Domination was born. My plan was simple in its audacity. I wouldn't remove my porch plants, not all of them anyway. I'd add to them. I'd add so many plants, so much greenery, that my house would become a living, breathing, blooming entity. I would cover my entire house in vines. Fast-growing, flowering vines. Vines that would climb the walls, engulf the windows, and transform my ordinary suburban home into a botanical spectacle. I envisioned a wall of green, a cascade of blossoms, a living tapestry of leaves and flowers. It would be beautiful. It would be overwhelming. It would be the antithesis of everything Karen stood for. And most importantly, it would be, technically, legal. Because the vines wouldn't be in pots. They'd be growing directly on the house. They'd be landscaping, not porch plants. I could already picture Karen's reaction. The sputtering outrage, the vein throbbing in her forehead, the inevitable meltdown. It was a beautiful image. I knew it was ridiculous. I knew it was probably going to be a lot of work, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about rebellion. It was about fighting for my right to have a slightly overgrown house. The key to the whole operation was finding the right vine. I needed something fast-growing, resilient, and preferably with spectacular flowers. After much research and a few late-night internet rabbit holes, I settled on it. Clematis armandi, an evergreen clematis with fragrant white flowers. It was known for its vigorous growth, its ability to quickly cover large areas, and its tendency to be a bit invasive perfect. My next step was to find a nursery that could supply me with enough clematis vines to cover an entire house. I found one a few towns over, a small, family-owned business run by a woman named Maggie, who had a passion for plants and a healthy disregard for HOAs. "So, let me get this straight," Maggie said, looking at my rather ambitious order for dozens of clematis vines. "You want to cover your house in vines? Because your HOA doesn't like your porch plants?" "Exactly," I said, nodding enthusiastically. "Think vertical garden. Think living wall. Think the greenest house in Arboretum Acres." Maggie stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I said. "I have a situation with my HOA president, and this is my response." Maggie grinned. "I love it. This is going to be amazing, but are you sure about this? This particular clematis, it's a bit of a grower." "That's the point," I said. "I want it to be aggressive. I want it to be unstoppable. I want it to be the botanical equivalent of a middle finger." "You got it," Maggie said, shaking her head and chuckling. "I'll get your order ready. And hey, can I get pictures when it's done? This is going on my website." And so, the planting began. It was a monumental task. I spent days preparing the soil, installing trellises and wires along the entire foundation of my house, creating a framework for the vines to climb. I felt like I was building a botanical scaffold, preparing my house for its transformation from ordinary suburban dwelling to living, breathing, green giant. Then came the vines themselves. Dozens of them, their roots carefully planted, their tendrils reaching out, eager to embrace their new home. It was like unleashing a botanical army, setting them loose to conquer the beige and reclaim my house for nature. The growth was astounding. Within days, the vines were climbing, reaching, spreading, their green tendrils snaking up the walls, across the trellises, towards the roof. It was like watching a time-lapse video, a botanical explosion of green. The neighbors, as expected, were fascinated. They'd stop and stare, their mouths agape, their expressions a mixture of shock, amusement, and a growing sense of, what on earth is that man doing? I even saw a few of them taking pictures. I suspected my vine-covered house was about to become the talk of Arboretum acres. My internal monologue was a constant stream of triumphant pronouncements and giddy anticipation. "Take that, Karen," I'd mutter to myself as the vines climbed higher. "Enjoy your aesthetic now." I imagined her face, contorted with rage, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her pearls. It was a beautiful thought. There was, of course, a brief visit from an HOA representative. Not Karen, thankfully. She was probably still recovering from the shock of seeing the first tendrils appear. "Mr. Riley?" he said, looking up at the rapidly expanding greenery, his voice a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "We've received some concerns about your landscaping." "Landscaping?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "What about it?" "Well," he said, stammering slightly, "it's rather extensive and unconventional." "It's vines," I said with a shrug. "Growing on my house, perfectly legal, not in pots, you see. Therefore not subject to the porch plant restrictions." He looked at the vines, then at the bylaws, then back at me. He clearly had no idea what to do. He mumbled something about consulting with the board, and retreated, looking utterly defeated. I, Jack Riley, had once again outmaneuvered the HOA, and my house, my soon-to-be botanical masterpiece, was continuing its transformation. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The neighborhood was buzzing, and I, for one, couldn't wait to see the final result. The transformation was complete. My house, once a perfectly ordinary, if slightly plant-enhanced suburban dwelling, was now something else entirely. It was a living, breathing, blooming mass of greenery. The Clematis Armandi had exploded, covering the walls, the roof, even the chimney in a cascade of fragrant white flowers. It was like living inside a giant, flowering hedge. It was spectacular. It was absurd. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. And, right on schedule, Karen arrived. She didn't even bother to park. She just screeched to a halt in front of my house, leaped out of her car, a meticulously clean beige SUV, naturally, and stood there, on the sidewalk, staring at my vine-covered home, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "What?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice a strangled whisper that quickly escalated into a shriek. "Have you done?" I emerged from behind a particularly lush curtain of vines, a picture of calm serenity, wearing a gardening hat and holding a pair of pruning shears. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice smooth and even. "You're admiring my landscaping, I presume?" "Landscaping?" she sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at the verdant mass that had engulfed my house. This is a jungle. You've turned your house into a living thing." "It's vertical landscaping, Karen," I corrected, with a perfectly straight face. "And, as you can see, it's perfectly compliant with the HOA bylaws. Remember that clause about potted plants? Well, these aren't in pots, are they? They're growing on the house. Therefore, they're landscaping." But it's covering everything," she stammered, her face turning a shade of green that almost, but not quite, matched the vines. "I call it The green embrace, I said with a shrug. It's quite cooling, actually, and it provides excellent insulation. Plus, I added, gesturing towards a cluster of butterflies flitting among the flowers, it's attracting all sorts of beneficial wildlife. Bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. It's an ecological paradise. Karen looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. It's monstrous, she declared. It's unnatural. It's alive. Well, yes, I said. That's generally what plants are, Karen. Alive. I'll have this vegetation removed, she vowed, her voice hoarse. I'll sue you, You'll do nothing, Karen, I said, my voice firm, because I've followed the rules. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go commune with nature. I turned and disappeared back into the leafy embrace of my vine-covered home, leaving Karen sputtering in impotent rage on the sidewalk. The emergency HOA meeting, Part 2, the Vine verdict, was, if possible, even more chaotic than the previous ones. Karen, looking like she hadn't slept in weeks, probably because she'd been too busy plotting my demise and/or having nightmares about giant flowering vines, presented her case with the fervor of a possessed preacher. At this meeting, the HOA changed to rules to apply to landscaping. This living house, she declared, her voice shaking with emotion, is an affront to everything Arboretum Acres stands for. It's a safety hazard. It's an eyesore. It's going to attract snakes. I had no idea where she got that one. She'd even brought in a botanist, a guy who looked suspiciously like her gardener, wearing a lab coat that was clearly too big for him, who testified about the dangers of invasive vines and the potential for structural damage to the house. It was all nonsense, of course, and I could tell even some of the board members were starting to roll their eyes. Then it was my turn. Miss Biggins, I began, addressing the board with a calm, reasonable demeanor that was, of course, entirely fake. Seems to be under the impression that I've somehow violated the HOA bylaws. I assure you, I have not. I presented my defense meticulously and methodically. I cited the previous bylaws, the ones in effect when I'd started my project, highlighting the fact that there were no restrictions on vines growing directly on the house. I argued that my green embrace was, in fact, landscaping, not potted plants, and therefore not subject to the porch plant restrictions. I presented evidence of the vines' benefits, the shade they provided, the cooling effect they had on the house, and the increased biodiversity they fostered in my yard. And, just for good measure, I'd brought along a real landscape architect, a neighbor who'd been secretly admiring my project. Mr. Riley's use of vertical gardening, the landscape architect said, is actually quite innovative. It's a sustainable and aesthetically pleasing way to enhance a property. And in this particular case, he added with a subtle smile, it's also a rather brilliant way to interpret the HOA guidelines. The other board members were, to put it mildly, divided. Some were clearly still loyal to Karen, but their support was rapidly dwindling. Others looked confused, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. And a few, I suspected, were secretly enjoying the spectacle, and perhaps even considering planting a few vines of their own. Then, a woman from the back of the room stood up. She was a biologist, another neighbor I'd spoken to briefly during my planting spree. I have to disagree with Miss Biggins's assessment, she said, her voice clear and strong. The vines Mr. Riley has chosen are not invasive. In fact, they're beneficial to the local ecosystem. They provide food and shelter for birds and insects, and they help to improve air quality. And, frankly, she added, with a twinkle in her eye, I think they're rather beautiful. That was the final blow. The board, facing a potential lawsuit, a public relations nightmare, and the growing realization that Karen had completely lost it, voted to do nothing. They couldn't even agree to pass the new amendment. The meeting ended in chaos, with Karen screaming about the end of civilization as we know it, and me, Jack Riley, the vine-covered victor, walking out with a smug, but well-deserved, I thought, smile on my face. But Karen, like a particularly persistent and thorny weed, wasn't about to give up. What followed was a period of escalating absurdity that I can only describe as the Vine War. Karen, obsessed with getting rid of my living house, or at the very least making my life miserable, tried every tactic she could think of. She filed complaints with the city, claiming the vines were a safety hazard, a structural threat, and a public nuisance. The city inspectors came, they inspected, and they found nothing. My vines were perfectly legal. She tried to organize a neighborhood petition to have them removed. She went door to door, armed with her clipboard and her think of the property values speech, trying to convince people that my vine-covered house was a threat to their peaceful, plant-free existence. The petition failed miserably. Most people either politely declined to sign or slammed the door in her face. Some even thanked me for finally standing up to her. She even, I suspect, attempted some minor acts of vandalism. I found a few, easily removed, Keep Arboretum Acres Beautiful signs stuck in the ground near the vines, and one morning I woke up to find a section of the vines mysteriously sprayed with weed killer. Apparently, she was hoping to kill them. She failed. Of course, I had security cameras everywhere, capturing her every move. And I, of course, responded in kind. Not with vandalism, oh no, I was above that. I responded with vine management. I started training the vines to grow in specific patterns. I created a giant HOA on one wall, with the letters formed by carefully pruned leaves. I shaped the vines around my windows to create living frames. And my personal favorite, I trained a section of vine to grow over my front door, creating a natural, leafy archway. I added decorative elements to the vines. Birdhouses strategically placed to attract even more birds. Karen hated birds. Wind chimes that would create a gentle, soothing melody, except when Karen was nearby, at which point I'd subtly increase the volume. And of course, fairy lights to illuminate the vines at night, creating a magical, enchanting glow. I even created a vine maze on my property, using strategically placed trellises and carefully pruned vines to create a winding, leafy labyrinth. It was surprisingly fun, and surprisingly difficult to navigate, even for me. And because why not, I hosted a Vine Appreciation Day party. I invited all the neighbors, except Karen naturally, put up decorations, more plants of course, and served refreshments, including vine-ripened tomatoes from my garden, which technically weren't grown on the vines, but close enough. The local news showed up, filming a segment about the ongoing feud between a homeowner and his HOA, and the living house that's taking the neighborhood by storm. I even set up a ticket booth and started charging admission for people to come take pictures. It was a glorious, ridiculous, utterly over-the-top spectacle. And with each passing day, with each new vine-related development, I could feel Karen's frustration growing, her power waning, her sanity slipping. The vines had become more than just plants. They were a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of creative and slightly unhinged resistance. And I, Jack Riley, the accidental botanist, was winning.